Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. On April 19th, 2012, video game education YouTube channel Extra Credits uploaded a video called True Female Characters: How to Write Deep and Interesting Characters. As an idea for a potential exciting game involving a strong female protagonist that audiences can take seriously and empathize with, host Daniel Floyd proposes, quote, "The struggle of a single mother trying to protect her children while crossing a war-torn country. So far as I know, no such game exists right now. However, there is a story, a children's story no less, with a very similar idea. The mother in question is not caught in a war in the traditional sense, but her fight for her family's survival against a catastrophic enemy that doesn't even know she exists feels no less turbulent, especially as she's not even human, but instead one of the smallest and most hunted creatures in the animal kingdom." Here is the saga of Robert C. O'Brien's Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, first published in 1971 and adapted into the animated film The Secret of NIMH in 1982, and recommended for audiences 12 and up. Mrs. Frisby, a field mouse living on the Fitzgibbons farm, struggles to provide for her 4 children without her late husband, Jonathan. Along with the daily chores of finding food and hiding from the humans and their ferocious cat, Dragon, Mrs. Frisby must now prepare to move her family to their summer home in the woods in order to avoid Farmer Fitzgibbons' deadly plow. But anxiety turns to fear when her youngest son, Timothy, falls ill with pneumonia, making him unable to safely endure the journey. When she learns of a mysterious colony of rats who gained extraordinary intelligence after their experimentation at the science facility, NIMH, Mrs. Frisby must gather her courage to request their help in making the miracle she so desperately needs for her son, never suspecting that she will provide them with a miracle of her own. One of the few novels by Robert Leslie Carroll Conley, Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH was inspired by the research of John B. Calhoun, an ethologist, or non-human behavior researcher, who famously used rats and mice in his experiments on overpopulation and societal collapse throughout the 1960s and 70s, and much of whose work took place at the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH, to this day the primary agency of the U.S. government responsible for biomedical research. The author had prior worked at National Geographic before turning to fiction writing. When his contract with them forbade him from publishing at other companies, he used his mother's maiden name, O'Brien, to create the pseudonym he's now best known by. The Secret of NIMH is the directorial feature-length debut and most critically acclaimed film as of 2023 of American animation legend Don Bluth, after he left Walt Disney Productions to establish his own animation studio in 1979. Funnily enough, legalities also forced O'Brien's heroine to undergo a name change for the film. Mrs. Frisby became Mrs. Brisby in order to avoid copyright infringement with the Frisbee flying disc. To be honest, I don't think Disney, had they tried, could have pulled this movie off back then because of the inappropriately cute musical it likely would have turned O'Brien's heavy subject matter into. Maybe not Timmy to the rescue level inappropriate, but still. Not to mention, in hindsight, Disney's own disastrous first attempt at dark fantasy, The Black Cauldron, in 1985. In defense of Disney, though, I do feel that O'Brien's writing, though sincere, is rather dry, to the point where Bluth's fantasy embellishments don't seem quite as cheapening as they could have. This is perhaps the greatest difference between the two versions: O'Brien's more realistic, nature-based account versus Bluth's medieval Redwall epic. For example, O'Brien leaves little to the imagination in terms of the literal science between the rats' captivity and subsequent evolution, shedding light not only on the experiments, but on the human doctors conducting them. Despite our sympathy to the rats' plight, he shows the humans as more ignorant than evil. Pages 108 to 113, Nicodemus narrating. So the young woman's name was Julie. The young man was George. They all put gloves on, long, tough plastic ones that came to their elbows. One by one we were taken from our cages, held gently but firmly by Dr. Schultz, while Julie fastened around each of our necks a narrow ribbon of yellow plastic bearing a number. I learned eventually that mine was number A10. They were kind, especially Julie. I remember that when one rat was being tagged, she looked at it and said, "Poor little thing, he's frightened. Look how he's trembling." "What kind of biologist are you?" said Dr. Schultz. "The poor little thing is a she, not a he." A little later in the morning they came around again, this time pushing a table on wheels. It was loaded with a bottle of some clear liquid, a long rack of sharp needles, and a plunger. Once more I was lifted from the cage. This time George did the holding while Dr. Schultz fastened one of the needles to the plunger. I felt a sharp pain in my hip. Then it was over. We all got used to that, for from then on we got injections at least twice a week. What they were injecting and why, I did not know. Yet for 20 of us, those injections were to change our whole lives. During the days that followed, our lives fell into a pattern, and the reason for our captivity gradually became clear. Dr. Schultz was a neurologist, that is, an expert on brains, nerves, intelligence, and how people learn things. He hoped, by experimenting on us, to find out whether certain injections could help us learn more and faster. The 2 younger people working with him, George and Julie, were graduate students in biology. "Watch always," he told them, "for signs of improvements, faster learning, quicker reaction in Group A as compared to Group B, and both as compared to the control group." Bluth, meanwhile, keeps his NIMH in near darkness in every sense, painting it as a hellish dungeon filled with suffering animal prisoners being senselessly tormented by nameless human monsters, all awash in dark colors, tense music, and nightmarish animation. Likewise, while I wouldn't call the book's characters dull per se, I do think that the film makes them more memorable by comparison. To name a few, Mr. Ages, a mouse scientist and physician, goes from reserved acquaintance to reclusive grump. Helpful crow Jeremy goes from naive youth to klutzy clown. Justin, the rat's virtuous captain of the guard, goes from cordial sentry to witty warrior. Nicodemus, the rat's benevolent leader who wants the colony to live an honest, self-sufficient existence away from man, goes from practical, eye-patch-donning strategist to powerful, glowing-eyed wizard. And Jenner, a selfish rat who wants to live on the comfort of human technology, goes from defector not even present in the book to full-on villain with beastly intentions. With all these differences in presentation and personality, the fact that Mrs. Frisby stays pretty much the same in both versions is as significant as it is impressive. Take note, writers. This is what a good, strong female character looks like. Yes, she's weak, unsophisticated, and very fearful, much of which, of course, stems from being a mouse. But that same fear, as well as the courage she gains later, stems also from being a grieving widow and single mother. She mourns the loss of her husband and feels lost without him, but knows full well she has to buck up for their children's sake. On top of that, she's just a lovely sweetheart. Not only is her graciousness and compassion refreshing, but the open mind and heart she shows when faced with scientific principles, ancient magic, or anything else beyond her comprehension are inspiring. Pages 27 to 28. When Mrs. Frisby went into her house, she found Timothy asleep and the other children waiting, frightened, sad, and subdued. "He went to sleep right after you left," Teresa said. "He's waked up twice, and the second time he wasn't delirious. He said his chest hurt and his head hurt. But Mother, he seemed so weak, he could hardly talk. He asked where you were, and I told him. Then he went back to sleep." Mrs. Frisby went to where Timothy lay, a small ball of damp fur curled under a bit of cloth blanket. He looked scarcely larger than he had when she and Mr. Frisby had carried him to Mr. Ages as an infant, and the thought of that trip made her wish Mr. Frisby were alive to reassure the children and tell them not to worry. But he was not, and it was she who must say it. Pages 81 to 82. Books. Her husband, Jonathan, had told her about them. He had taught her and the children to read. The children had mastered it quickly, but she herself could barely manage the simplest words. She had thought perhaps it was because she was older. He had also told her about electricity. He had known these things, and so, it emerged, did the rats. It had never occurred to her until now to wonder how he knew them. He had always known so many things, and she had accepted that as a matter of course. But who had taught him to read? Strangely, it also emerged that he had known the rats. Had they taught him? What had been his connection with them? She remembered his long visits with Mr. Ages, and Mr. Ages knew the rats too. She sighed. Perhaps when the meeting was over and she had had a chance to talk to Nicodemus, and had told him about Timothy and moving day, perhaps when that was settled, he could explain all this to her. Now, I've heard it argued that this story's premise has a fatal narrative flaw. The fact that a quote-unquote normal mouse has a name, wears clothes, and displays other human habits and traits supposedly negates the novelty and significance of the rat's abilities. A fair assessment, but allow me to respectfully offer a counter-argument. Consider the biblical tale of Adam and Eve. Like God's first man and woman before the forbidden fruit, Mrs. Frisby is not unintelligent, just unenlightened. In a word, innocent. The rats, however, are Adam and Eve after eating, or should I say being force-fed, the fruit, in the form of NIMH's DNA-altering injections. This results in a metaphorical exile from paradise when their animal innocence is destroyed. For all their physical and intellectual progress, they are tragically unable to return to the blissful ignorance of their ordinary rat brethren. Page 144. Occasionally we came upon other rats, and a few times we talked with them, but not for long, because after just a few words they would begin to look at us strangely and edge away. Somehow they could tell that we were different. I think we even looked different. Either the diet or the injections at NIMH had made us bigger and stronger than other rats, and all the strange rats we saw looked, to us, surprisingly weak and puny, so we were set apart from even our own kind. When I first experienced the more academic Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, and the more mystical The Secret of NIMH as a child, I was too young to fully understand, let alone appreciate, the story in either format. Having given both a sporting chance as an adult, though, I think the fact that a single story of a mouse facing impossible odds out of maternal love is being well told practically in two separate genres as well as media not only shows exceptional storytelling on two different artists' parts, but makes for a more unique and enriching experience. Whether it's Mrs. Frisby or Mrs. Brisby, whose hero's journey you join, it will be one that can inspire even the meekest of souls to accomplish the most incredible feats. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you.